I've worked a lot with speech and debate topics, and I tend to work on international issues, globalization, development economics. And what I'd like to do in the few minutes I have here is to give some sort of economic history, some look at the global economy and the U.S. economy from an international perspective. I was in Bucharest, Romania 2 weeks ago giving a series of talks to college students there, different colleges and some think tanks. And that gives us some background. You know, Romania had about 50 years of communist rule, and by the time that was over, the economy was incredibly backward and corrupt, and the people were pretty much impoverished. And young people in Romania are really interested in economics. They do well in school. They know that Romanians that leave the country do well in other economies, but they're very, very poor, and they're wondering where wealth comes from, what creates wealth. And so my discussions there were on basically social order, about organizing the economy. And one of the ways to look at is different ways of, different kinds of social order. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. You know, if you think about it, the economics is a coordination problem as much as it is about capital. You might say, well, why is it that Americans are so wealthy? Well, we've got, you know, $100,000 or $150,000 worth of machinery for every one of us in the country. There's all sorts of capital here that we take advantage of when we work that helps us be more productive in our factories and other places. But capital on its own doesn't solve the problem. You know, you can pour tons of capital into poor countries with foreign aid or investment. How do you create wealth? Here's one of the examples I'm going to talk about. In Romania, there's not a lot of highways, partly because of they didn't have a lot of cars during communist times. And in the streets in Bucharest, the roads are just jammed. People have bought more cars in recent years, and it's stop-and-go traffic, and it's a big mess. So not many highways, not a lot of train infrastructure, and jam traffic all the time. So they wonder, you know, why is that? How do they fix that? Well, they could come to the Bay Area, where we spent tens of billions of dollars on infrastructure for transportation. And how does our system work? Well, some of the empty chairs tell us something about that. People are jammed up in traffic trying to get here. So we spent vast amounts of money on highways, on light rail, and all this stuff, and still we have a system that doesn't work transportation-wise. In fact, this is a very dangerous part for the U.S. economy. If the economy starts to grow and our roads continue not to work, our railways continue not to work very well, we just simply can't grow. You know, companies will have more and more trouble trying to get from place to place. Workers will be stuck in traffic more. So this is an area where you can use economics to understand the nature of the problem. You know, you talk to some people, what's the problem? Oh, too many people have cars. Or people aren't carpooling enough. Or we haven't invested enough in light rail, which our current president plans to solve by pouring billions more into light rail, right? Well, is that the solution to the problem? And again, economics gives us some insight. One of the homeschool debate topics last year for one of the organizations was on transportation infrastructure. So we had a number of seminars on that. So I'm going to come back to that with an example. How do we make our freeways work better, and how is it some countries prosper and others don't? Now I start with economics talks, a normal place, talking about Adam Smith and his book, The Wealth of Nations. But the more the background to Adam Smith is he's a moral philosopher who was looking around Scotland, looking around Edinburgh, and just noticing that people were wealthier. Noticing that on average, everyday people were living better than their parents. Their houses were nicer, their clothes were nicer, their diet was nicer, that people were more productive. And so he was wondering where, you know, what was the source of this prosperity? I mean, they were still very poor by our standards, but they were more prosperous than they used to be. And why was that? And so his Wealth of Nations is looking at the economic system, the sort of esoteric idea in a sense that people pursuing their own self-interest, trying to produce more, get more wealth for themselves and their families, were driven, he said, by an invisible hand to help others. And this concept of spontaneous order that wasn't organized for the top down was what he was trying to explain in The Wealth of Nations. Whereas most people believe that wealth in England came from mercantilism, from the leaders of the country, from the aristocrats, sort of organizing society and trying to control trade and get surpluses of gold, things like that. Adam Smith was saying, no, if the government just gets out of the way, you end up getting this prosperity. So that was the ideas part of the idea he was presenting. There's a marvelous little book called How the Scots Invented the Modern World. Particularly if you're part Scottish, this book is extremely appealing because it claims that the Scots did everything in the world. But interestingly, Scotland in the 1600s was the poorest country in Western Europe, incredibly destitute. Through the 1700s and early 1800s, Scotland became the wealthiest country in all of Europe. Scots were dominant in medicine and science and technology and engineering, and Scots engineers were a huge part of the British Empire, presumably doing more of the good things in the British Empire than the bad things that the empire did. But apart from that, the Scots created a tremendous amount of wealth. The question is, how did they do it? So that's a story from a long time ago. Let's take a story from the 1990s. Those of you who have heard my presentations before might know some of this, but in the and these are two books by the Independent Institute, by the way, Lessons from the Poor, that's for sale in the next room, and Making Poor Nations Rich are great anthologies looking at success examples for creating wealth in poor countries around the world. But there's a chapter in Making Poor Nations Rich as well about one country that was the poorest country in Western Europe in the 1980s. In fact, when I lived in New York and would go down to restaurants in New York City, virtually everyone that served me had an accent. They were all from the same country. Pretty much all of them were there illegally. And for those that don't know the answer from my seminars, you want to guess what country that was from? Huge amount of illegal immigrants in New York and in Boston in the 1980s. One country? It's Ireland. In the field of development economics that I studied, we considered Ireland sort of a developing economy because it was like some country from Africa or somewhere else stuck in Western Europe. People were incredibly poor. 2 out of every 3 college graduates left the country within 6 months of graduating. And what happened? Well, it turns out that the economy, the regulations, the taxes were part of a long history in Ireland that made it difficult to do business there. They changed their policies. They put in new policies to lower taxes, reduce regulations. The European Union integrated so there could be more trade throughout Europe. By 2005 or so, 20 years later, Ireland becomes the wealthiest country in all of Europe. Right? So in just 20 years, this incredibly poor, backward country by Western European standards prospers. Now, they've taken a severe hit during the financial crash, and they overinvested in real estate and banking problems like other countries. But still, there was tremendous economic growth. And sort of the question is, where did that come from? How did that happen? And in the Making Poor Nations Rich book, there's charts, and so you can see tracking Ireland to other countries and more of that story. This is a relevant story for people concerned about poverty in Africa, poverty in Latin America, concerned about immigration from Mexico. What sort of policies would allow countries poor now to become wealthier faster? And that's a big part of what economics is about. So I've got some promotional overheads here where I've mentioned my organization, Economic Thinking, where I work. We've got more online materials there. Liberty Flicks, as we also have a number of films and documentaries about freedom. I want to mention the Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org, that is sponsoring past seminars, and I hope will come to their senses and sponsor future seminars that I do. Also, the Freeman Online, we've got some sample copies of the Freeman in the next room. Given that I'm here at the Independent Institute, I should also mention their website, a wealth of information on a huge range of topics, and I hope you'll take advantage, for those of you in Extemp and Debate, reviewing their website, looking at the articles that are online from the Independent Review, and you can also find out about the summer seminars that are there as well. Okay, time flies when you're giving a talk. I'm going to move through quickly here. In this overhead, I'm mentioning a book called The White Man's Burden. And in this, William Easterly is looking at the issue of Africa and poverty in Africa, and he's taking this spontaneous order idea, and the language he uses is contrasting the planners to the searchers. He says, if you want to know what's wrong with Africa, what's been so difficult, what, $1 trillion, $500 billion of foreign aid poured into Africa over the years, and yet they're poorer now than they were decades ago. He said the problem is that the money went to planners, went people who came to Africa with their SUVs and their plans for building a dam here or building hospitals there. These top-down plans weren't the way to create wealth. Instead, he suggests the role of searchers, entrepreneurs, people that are discovering what services, just like Adam Smith is talking about, people that are trying to provide for themselves, do so by providing services to others. And this comes from a work, Friedrich Hayek, Austrian economist. You can find this on the online Library of Liberty online. He has an essay called Kinds of Order in Society. And in that, he contrasts the planned orders versus spontaneous orders. Please come in, come in, come in. Spontaneous orders versus planned orders. And I'm going to give some examples of that from different sectors of the economy. Again, kinds of order in society. We can look at transportation policy, environmental policy, development, foreign aid policy. And in each of these cases, we've got planners, people that have a plan for the U.S. transportation infrastructure, right? The Department of Transportation, they says we want to put in light rail here, we want to put in bridges to nowhere in Alaska, we want to do these various infrastructure investments, and it's a top-down plan. How would the market respond to transportation issues? What would the bottom-up plan be like for transportation? Well, in each of these cases, planned orders versus spontaneous orders. In the summer, I'm going to talk more about, I'll have more time to cover these different sectors of the economy and spend more time applying these ideas. But let me just spend a few minutes on the giant overhead. Let me skip through that. Again, in each of these things, whether it's medical care, education, transportation, whatever, there's ideas that scholars have about how things work, theories that they have. There's interest, there's special interests that want things done certain ways, and there's events. In transportation, who are the interests? Well, there's the people that build the roads, there's the car manufacturers, there's the transportation planners. There's events in the past that led the government to, our original roads were built privately, the toll roads and the plank roads earlier in the Republic. But each of these areas, you've got ideas, events, and interests. There's a whole bunch of great books on transportation policy. This one, Gridlock by Randy O'Toole, just came out. There's a Reason Foundation book on mobility, and then the Independent Institute has a book called Street Smart, Competition, Entrepreneurship, and the Future of Roads. And here's just a couple examples. Or do I have time for a couple examples? I'm actually I have a couple little, okay. Gridlock, people say there's too many people on the streets. I go to Bucharest, Romania, and the roads are jammed. And I tell them, you know why your roads are jammed? You have socialist roads. You have communist roads. I mean, people in Bucharest know that under communism, the food was underpriced in the grocery stores and people would stand in line for hours to get food. One of my friends, Anka Russo there, her grandfather died of pneumonia standing in line trying to get milk because they had 3 kids in their family and the mother couldn't get enough milk on her own. People waited in line because the food was underpriced and people lined up to get it. What happens on the highway? The highway is underpriced at rush hour. At rush, a lot of times it works fine because the number of people who want to drive on it, the road's big enough to accommodate them. What about rush hour? Lots of people want to get someplace at rush hour, the road's jammed up. There's no way, there's no pricing on the road. There's no pricing for congestion. You might say, well, wait a minute, the road should be free, they should just build more roads. Why not have the people who drive on the roads pay for the roads? People that want to come to our seminars are stuck in traffic. That's a terrible travesty for those people. They're going to be ignorant their whole lives because they missed this seminar because of these roads. So interestingly, in Los Angeles, during the Olympics, they did a big test on people on the roads. They went out at rush hour, they did a full survey. They found out that over half the people on the freeways at rush hour weren't on their way to work. What were they doing on the freeway? Well, there were lots of unemployed people on the freeway at rush hour. Why? They were unemployed. They had plenty of time, right? There were a number of students, some going to college on the road. There were a bunch of teenagers on the freeway. Why? Because they forgot. The thing is, if you charge people, if you spend an extra hour every day on the highway because of congestion, and you earn, let's say, $10 an hour, that's $10 every day that just goes up in smoke, wasted in queuing costs. If they charged you $10 to be on the freeway at rush hour, you'd be, if you saved an hour because of that $10 charge, you'd be ahead or even, right? And that money is wasted because we don't charge some sort of fee. People aren't allowed to pay to get there. And that there's more to that story, but instead what we have is the government spending vast amounts for light rail. Here's just one light rail, whoops, back this. Here's a light rail project in Austin, Texas, where they spent, it was supposed to be $60 million, they spent $140 million for it so far, and it takes a total of a couple hundred people a day to work, total. I used to be in San Jose, and the light rail system there was great. You could get on it at rush hour, and there was hardly anybody there. There were always seats. Except what's wrong with that picture? Taxpayers are paying huge amounts of money to subsidize people on the light rail, and the others are stuck in traffic on the highway. So that's a top-down plan. Top-down planners tried to make that work. Instead, we want a bottom-up plan that has entrepreneurs, that has innovative ways to solve transportation problems that would apply in the US as well as in other countries. So the other 45 minutes of my 15-minute presentation I'm going to pass for right now, and let's just open up for a couple questions, and then we'll turn it over to the next speaker.